Medieval India, page number 97, chapter number 9. The Chola traditions of village self-government were considerably weakened under the Vijayanagar rule. The growth of hereditary Nayakships tended to curb their freedom and initiative. The governors of the provinces were royal princes at first. Later, persons belonging to vassal ruling families and nobles were also appointed as governors. The provincial governors had a large measure of autonomy. They held their own courts, appointed their own officers, and maintained their own armies. They were allowed to issue only their own coins, though of small denominations only. There was no regular term for a provincial governor. His term depending on his ability and his strength. The governor had the right to impose new taxes or remit old ones. Each governor paid a fixed contribution in men and money to the central government. It had been estimated that while the income of the kingdom was 12 lakh parados, the central government only got half the amount. Thus, some historians think that Vijayanagar was more a confederacy than a centralized empire. There were many areas which were under the control of subordinate rulers, that is, those who had been defeated in war. But those kingdoms had been restored to them. The king also granted amaram or territory with fixed revenue to military chiefs. These chiefs, who were called Paligar or Nayaks, had to maintain a fixed number of foot soldiers, horses, and elephants for the service of the state. The Nayaks or Paligars also had to pay sum of money to the central exchequer. They formed a very powerful section, and sometimes it was difficult for the government to control them. These internal weaknesses of the Vijayanagar Empire contributed to its defeat in the Battle of Bani Hathi and its subsequent disintegration. Many of the Nayaks, such as those of Tanjore and Madurai, became independent from that time. Historians are not agreed about the economic conditions of the peasantry under the Vijayanagar rule, because most of the travelers had little knowledge about villages' life and thus spoke of it in very general terms. In general, it may be presumed that the economic life of the people remained more or less the same. Their houses were mostly thatched with a small door. They generally went about barefooted and wore little above the waist. People of the upper classes sometimes wore costly shoes and a silk turban on their heads, but did not cover themselves above the waist. All classes of people were fond of ornaments and wore them in their ears, on their necks, on their arms, etc. We have very little idea about the share of the produce the peasants were required to pay. According to an inscription, the rates of taxes were as follows: 1/3 of the produce of kurvai, a type of rice during the winter, 1/4 of sesame, ragi, horse gram, etc., 1/6 of millet and other crops cultivated on dry land. Thus, the rate varied according to the type of crops, soil, method of irrigation, etc. In addition to the land tax, there were various other taxes such as property tax, tax on sale of produce, profession taxes, military contribution in times of distress, tax on marriage, etc. The 16th century traveler Nikitin says, "The land is overstocked with people, but those in the country are very miserable, while the nobles are extremely affluent and delight in luxury." Urban life grew under the Vijayanagar Empire and trade flourished. Many of the towns grew around temples. The temples were very large and needed supply of foodstuffs and commodities for distribution of prasadam to the pilgrims, service of the god, the priest, etc. The temples were rich and also took active part in trade, both internal and overseas. Thank you for tuning in. In the next part, we'll start with the advent of Portuguese on page number 98. Thank you. All the best for exams, and do share and subscribe the channel for more videos like this. On your screen, you might see some playlist of the previously made chapters and of the modern India and other books available. Thank you and do watch them as well. All the best.